Hi, my name is Frances Gordon and I'm here to give a 30-minute presentation on how training can help you to create a plain language culture. I work for a company called Simplified Communication, and we've been training people to write in plain language, and we've been building plain language cultures for around 20 years. So I'm here to share some of my opinions and tools and techniques with you. Firstly, why plain language? Why do it at all, and what is it? It's easiest perhaps to explain what the kind of consensual definition is by using the ISO standard for plain language that is currently under application. And according to this standard, there are 4 principles. So the content is what the audience needs or wants. The audience can easily find the content that they need or want. The audience can understand the content. And very important, the audience can use the content to meet their needs. So you can see plain language goes way beyond a particular word you use or particular sentence construction. We think of it in an outcomes-based way. But why? Why do we want to do it at all? The reason why we want to do plain language is to enable people to understand what they're buying before they're buying. We want to help people to make informed decisions. We want to avoid trickery and misleading people, whether on purpose or by mistake. We want people to be able to understand the contracts that bind them. And also we want them to be able to understand what rights they have and what obligations they have in everyday life. And we want to do this not only in our legal content, but also in our marketing content. We want to do that throughout the customer or citizen experience. So that's kind of what plain language is and why we do it. I want to talk a little bit, before we get into some nitty-gritty tools, I want to talk a little bit about why a change to plain language is so profound. Why do we find it so difficult? Well, after many years of helping companies and large organizations change to plain language and doing a lot of training programs, I realized that from a kind of emotional point of view, it's difficult for us. A lot of times it's because of the way we were taught how to write at school, because often we were taught that the more complex language we knew, the more jargon that we could use, the more we'd be in the kind of in-group, the exclusive group. And we'd get the best mark possible then if we used the most complex constructions and the best jargon. I always give an example of myself at university. At one stage, I loved kind of postmodern literary theory, and I remember writing an essay about Jacques Derrida. And I got the highest mark in, the history of the department. It was amazing. But then the comment made me worry, because the comment said, even I did not understand this. And that the professor, I think, meant as a compliment. But I think that's why we kind of often enter the workplace with a very skewed perspective of how we meant to use language. So it's hard from an emotional level, because we have to, as individuals, let go often of what we taught and what we were rewarded for at school and at university. But there's actually a more psychological reason, and Steven Pinker, in his book A Sense of Style, talks about the curse of knowledge. And it's a really interesting idea. And he explains the idea as follows: that if you, for instance, have a toddler in your lounge or your sitting room, and you have a chocolate bar, and say you hide the chocolate bar behind the television, and you call the toddler in and you say, find the chocolate bar, and the toddler will look in all different places, behind the couch, he'll look behind the bookcase, under the carpet, under the rug, wherever it is, and finally the toddler will find the chocolate bar. And then you'll say to the toddler, okay, we're going to bring in your friend now, and where will your friend first look for the chocolate bar? And the toddler will say, well, behind the television, because that's what it is. Because the toddler then is cursed with knowledge. He cannot imagine what it would be like for another toddler not to know what he knows at that time. And what Steven Pinker explains as a cognitive psychologist is that we learn to understand rationally or logically that somebody won't understand as much as we do, but we never really psychologically lose the curse of knowledge. We are always cursed for knowledge. We can't fundamentally ever take ourselves back in time and put ourselves in that position of somebody who doesn't understand what we understand. So it's incredibly difficult to really empathize with the user. In fact, it's a psychological impossibility. So we really have to work at our techniques. So plain language is hard on a psychological and a cognitive level because we are cursed by knowledge. Plain language is also really profound on a social level. And the idea of the Plain English campaign, Plain English, really was popularized by Chrissie Mayr, who was awarded an OBE for starting the Plain English campaign. And in preparation for this talk, I reread some of what she wrote about her early life in post-war Liverpool. And she writes in as to be expected, a very everyday way about her childhood, where there was appalling poverty, where her experience of going to school seemed to be very much about getting food and being hungry, and the trauma of delousing and the violence and the abuse that she faced. There wasn't a lot of learning that happened, I think, at her school. And she learned to read or write as a teenager, but she never learned very well. And she only really learned how to read or write as a young adult. And as a young adult, she became passionate and incredibly enthusiastic about the importance of not only individuals learning the language of the bureaucracies of the NHS and of the welfare system, but actually those bureaucracies actually starting to speak to people like they speak to people in the language that they understood. And one of the things she did many things, but one of the things she did is she founded Britain's first community newspaper. It was called, and you can see in the top right of that image, written by the people for the people. You can see the article about a conspiracy of silence on benefits, and she advocated on improving the forms that people use to apply for benefits and improving the way the NHS talked to its patients. So this profound social movement is really also tied up in the notion of plain language. And the amount of activism in plain language also, I think, speaks to how difficult it is to change on a social level or on an organizational level to plain language. My own inspiration for plain language comes from my home country, South Africa. And the image you see on your screen right now is the signage on the Constitutional Court. Now, I, on my 21st birthday, had the chance to vote for the first democratic in the first democratic election in South Africa. And one of the things that came out of the first democratically elected government was a plain language constitution. And it was written by a bunch of plain language experts that were brought in from all over the world, and South African lawyers and activists. And very much key to the idea of this plain language constitution was the idea that this constitution would be written in language that everybody can understand. And what I want to point out here is the notion of understanding that not everybody speaks English is incredibly important. So this sign uses the 11 languages of South Africa. And I think in most places around the world, the notion of doing plain language, to me, is the notion of looking outside English and really understanding what languages people are using outside English. And this is why, one of the reasons why it's difficult, right? A change to plain language, and the way to truly think deeply about plain language isn't just about a workshop on making your sentences a little bit easier to read. It's quite a profound change. It's a different way of thinking. If you ever are in Johannesburg and visit the Constitutional Court, you will see the foyer of it is the most incredible architecture. It's got a glass ceiling and the architecture is built like a tree. And the whole idea is justice under a tree. And I think that's an amazing metaphor for plain language, where the language you used is that language a community would use to discuss and solve a problem under a tree in a village. So you can see that the huge change that South Africa went through from the very rigid apartheid top-down system of language where you were told what language to speak and when and how, to this very human-centric plain language approach was incredibly profound. And this is what plain language is. And when we talk about a culture shift, what better example than the shift from apartheid to a plain language constitution. When we learn how to do plain language, we've shown that it's very difficult. We've got to change and we've got to make choices to overcome old habits that are no longer useful. And these habits might be psychological habits, they might be cognitive habits, or they might be social norms that we've got used to. So changing to plain language is by nature a change in culture. So what does a plain language culture look like? Well, I haven't gone into a lot of detail here, but to give you some ideas, to me, the markers of a plain language culture would be a common understanding of plain language. So you don't have one role or discipline thinking about plain language in one way and another in another way. There's a common understanding. And it's understanding of the true meaning of plain language. There's a metric and a way of evaluating, a way of seeing if something is in plain language. And that metric ladders up to organizational goals. There's fast induction into plain language norms, and that's because plain language as a culture, it isn't something that an organization can do once and then it's done. It requires constant training and constant inductions. It's an ongoing process of plain language. And very important as well, and a lot of the regulations point this out when you look at treating customers fairly, a plain language culture can't be a culture that goes to a central resource to somehow magically convert everything into plain language. A plain language culture is something that exists throughout the organization and not just in a little team that's overworked trying to convert everything into plain language. How do I know what training needs to be done for different organizations and different roles? I'm going to introduce you to a framework that I like to use. It's called the Willing and Able framework. And there's a reference at the end of the presentation to where it's from. But this framework is actually used and adapted by many different educationalists and learning and development professionals. And the way it works, it's a simple matrix. So going from down to up, you'll go from being unable to have the skills to being able to have the skills. And going from left to right, horizontal, you'll go from being unwilling to change to being willing to change. And the idea is for change, it's not just about ability or competence, it's also about the will. Do we want to? Have we made that choice? So those are the two frameworks that we have to look at. It's quite a useful framework because often we are guilty, I think, of focusing a little bit more on the competence and we forget about the will. There is a third dimension as well that I'm going to introduce you to later. We use this framework firstly to diagnose where we need to focus our training efforts in an objective way, so we're not subjective about this, and then what content to use, so how are we going to solve that to build this plain language culture. So the first question we are going to look at is we're going to look at the kind of horizontal axis, ability, and we're going to say, well, what do you need for ability? And for ability, you need skills, and there's also some knowledge that you need. So we look at those two parameters, skills and knowledge. Our next job if you want to build a culture, is to find out, well, do we have low knowledge? Do we have low skills? Because you want to situate your teams into one of these 4 quadrants. I'm not giving the full diagnostic criteria here, but just to give you an idea of what you need to develop and think about. When you're diagnosing, when you're trying to see whether an organization or team has low knowledge, you'll often hear things like this. These are my warning signs. There is not knowledge. There's something missing in the knowledge framework. When people say, we don't want to dumb down. So there's not an understanding of what plain language is. We don't want to dumb down. Plain language won't meet legal requirements because they think that to meet legalities, you've got to write in an impenetrable way. Or we're too creative. So plain language is just a little bit boring for us. We're a little bit more creative than that. So these are signals to me there's a knowledge gap. We don't know what plain language is. We don't know what to do. Then when we have a skills gap, what I look out for are people saying it can't be done. Our stuff is really difficult. So the diagnostic criteria you'll often hear people say is, wow, well, I understand that you can do it for simple things, but we're a little bit different. You know, we're a financial institution. We write legal things. It's really complicated. So often this idea of thinking it can be done for others, but not for ourselves is they just don't know it can be done. It's low skills, right? So that's how we diagnose for low skills. So how do we solve for this lack of ability? And I'm not giving you the full solution, but I'm just kind of showing you a framework to think. Well, if a team has low knowledge, we will look at content chunks such as definition of plain language, the legal requirements for plain language, myths and how to dispel them, and we'll give examples. If there's low skill, that's really often where traditional writing coaches or trainings happen, the level of helping people know and we're giving them the tools and techniques and practicing and how to plan, organize, write, and design. And any good trainer will know you apply to a generic example first and then to a relevant example for you. So that's how you would solve for that. Willingness. We're on our vertical axis, if you might be fitting into one of these quadrants. And willingness, to me, I've simplified a little bit here, but willingness really is belief in the benefits of change. Because if you don't have that belief, then no matter how much ability, how much knowledge and skills you have, you're not going to really want to make the choice to change. And if it's a low level, the most common things that we hear are things like this. Users won't want to read this anyway. And because we love data, we'll say, well, analytics show that no one clicks on this section. No one wants to read the ins and outs of fees or what to do if you're in trouble. No one goes there. So it's just not important. Nobody cares. We've never heard any complaints about it. It's fine. And then we'll often hear people say, well, even I don't read this. So lawyers often tell me that. Well, even I don't read this. So how would an ordinary user read it? So a low belief in the benefits, not really understanding the why. So what do we do for that case? Well, we look at research, we look at case studies, and we look at internal research and insights that we've drawn. So there might be some focus group findings that we can use. There might be, and there are many case studies that show commercial, organizational, and compliance benefits of plain language. And there's a lot of literature out there showing these true benefits of plain language. So that's the type of content that we will train in for lack of will. But can you see, if we just focused on the ability, we would not change the culture because we need the will as well. And here's the trick. After quite a long time, I read something from the BCG and I realized that there's a third dimension, readiness. Again, I've simplified it a little bit, but it's really the perceived need for urgent change, because you can be able, you can be willing, but if you're not organizationally ready, it still doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. So if there is not readiness, and this is actually incredibly common, we'll hear things like this. We don't have enough resources. Leadership doesn't support this initiative. There's just other business priorities. We'll do it next year. There's risk. The risk of not complying with plain language requirements is quite low. Nobody's going to say that we're not in plain language, so there's a low risk there. And then what we have is still better than what our competitors have, so we're okay. We think we're doing okay. So all of those points would say, well, there's a lack of readiness. There's a lack of urgency. So how are we going to address that? We're going to address that through a number of ways. And I think one of the most important of these ways is to have a proper evaluation mechanism, a metric, which ladders up to organizational goals. So we need to be able to say, is my content in plain language? And there's a number of ways that we can measure plain language, whether something is clear. They range from, on the left-hand side of this kind of line I have on the screen now, is the textual-based ones, things that look at the text and they look at rules of the text, short sentences and complex constructions and use of familiar words, and they come up with some kind of score. It's called a readability score, and there's a whole lot of indexes you can use. When you hear about grade levels, grade level 9 or grade level 10, we must write to a grade level 8. That's very much a textual-based criteria. It's looking at text and using some kind of algorithm to measure the text. Then going through, we'll have something that is more criteria-based, so it's more something like a checklist, and we see a lot of those as around. So a checklist might say something like, is your main point of the document made prominent? And an expert would go through and give a reason, and they might give a score, or they might just be a compliance kind of checklist. So that's a criteria-based, where the expert uses their experience of readers and context to see if something's in plain language. And then you have the absolute best way, the outcomes-based, the testing way that will use task-based tests or comprehension tests to test whether readers in their context can actually understand. And it's fantastic if this can be done for every piece of content, but in a lot of organizations, there just aren't the resources. And one of the sad things in a way, and I think it stops a plain language culture from being developed, is when people just rely on the readability scores. So when people just rely on these readability scores, there often really is a problem with the plain language culture, because you have very superficial changes. So you have sentences written a little bit more nicely, a little bit better. You don't have true change to a plain language culture. However, readability scores are useful. They're useful because they can tell us when something is bad. They can't tell us if it's good. They can only tell us if we fail a readability score, we know our content is bad. If we're writing to, a grade 12 level, we're writing public information to a grade 12 level, we know it's not good enough. There's no debate. Do we know it's good and will actually meet the needs of the readers though? We don't know. So the model that I often like to use is this. Using these as a filter. So first, a piece of content is tested for readability, and if it passes that, it goes through some kind of checklist, and if it passes that, it might be selected for research. Because unless you're in a very big organization, you often just cannot research every piece of content that you write. Often once you introduce this model, the content owner, the person who owns the content, would work out the readability score, and if it passes that, they would send that to the expert team, and if that goes, it'll be sent for consideration for research to a specialist research team. The idea, though, for the system to work is everyone needs to be told about and even have skills in all these mechanisms, because if you only train people to look at a readability score, they're going to really take to heart the fact that you need to remember the definition of plain language. You need to enable a reader to use their information to meet their needs. So everybody needs to be trained, needs to understand, and needs to learn these different kinds of evaluations. Then these evaluations must ladder up to a company goal, whether that's a fairness goal. I like laddering up to a fairness goal, net promoter scores, any of the acquisition metrics, commercial metrics, or any other cost of queries, any other commercial metrics. It needs to ladder up to something else in the organization. It can't sit there just as something to do with content, because it's never then taken that seriously. And you never get that readiness that's so necessary for a plain language culture. So how do we solve for that? Well, we've got our evaluation mechanism for readiness. We need to look at the consequences of not using plain language and really look at that reputational damage that is being caused by not using plain language. And of course, you can use insights from internal research. So that's the readiness arm. Then the last question I want to ask in the last 5 minutes is, how do I create the training that can change culture? So I'm going to just give you a little bit of a taste of this. Well, at this stage, you've used the tool. You've got all these different cards. I use little cards of all the different pieces of content that I want to look at for my plain language culture. But there's something that I found kind of quite interesting, especially when training in pandemic environments, is that when training, especially if it's a recording and people are stressed and people are rushed and people are a little bit sick, maybe, we are really close to change. And the neuroscientists talk about the reptilian brain, and they talk about when we're closed-minded, when we're stressed, when we're tired and we're anxious, we are not open to learning. We don't learn. We're not open to change. I certainly saw this when training in the first few months of lockdown. And even now, we need to, as a trainer, really pay attention to opening people's minds to co-creation. And so once we've got all the various pieces of content we need to train, we need to look at how the learner can co-create their learners. So how they can reflect, analyze, have insight, come up with ideas, imagine, practice, examine. And for every piece of content in this world, and I think actually forever, we need to look at co-creation. We need to look at, for example, reflecting on what you see as plain language and whether it would meet these definitions and requirements. For case studies, we need to let learners analyze and quantify benefits and align to company goals themselves. Instead of just showing the rewrites, we need to encourage delegates to imagine what their content would look like if it could change. So we need to co-create this vision for plain language. For plain language skills, we need to focus not only on the practicing, which is important, we also need to focus on the reviewing. You might use those content crits, but we need to focus more on reflection. And then what I found really effective is not only reviewing, but challenge ourselves and challenge the learners to solve problems in different ways. So we did it in this way. Now let's try another way. Let's try a way that isn't traditional plain language. We need to really let learners co-create that learning, create their own evaluation mechanisms, have real-world practices. And when one starts to do that, I found that my training practices kind of changed with plain language culture work, because the actual content becomes self-directed, maybe in recordings, because that's kind of what people want now. And the only need for facilitation is in co-creation. So your facilitation sessions aren't lectures. They are co-creation spaces. Your straight learning is no longer within the training. It can be self-directed outside in recordings. And there's a lot of literature at the moment about the flipped classroom And it's a really interesting thing when we're training for a culture change. So my last slide is references. And it remains for me to say thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed, and I think I'm having a session where we will reflect and co-create and engage on this presentation and related issues. So see you there.